August 1969, Bethel, New York. The Woodstock Music Festival was 2 days away from changing music history forever. 500,000 people would eventually gather on Max Yasgur's farm, but right now, in the late afternoon of August 13th, it was just musicians, crew members, and organizers trying to prepare for something nobody fully understood yet. Carlos Santana was 22 years old and on the edge of everything he'd ever wanted. His band, also called Santana, had been playing the San Francisco scene for 2 years. They were good, more than good. They'd built a following playing clubs like the Fillmore, mixing Latin rhythms with rock guitar in ways nobody else was doing. Their sound was distinctive, hypnotic, and Carlos knew it. He could feel success coming. Woodstock would be their breakthrough moment. He was certain of that. Carlos arrived at the festival site on Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before the music would start. The stage was still being built. Electrical cables snaked everywhere. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and diesel fuel from generators. It was chaotic, unfinished, somehow both exciting and terrifying. His bandmates were nervous. This would be their first major festival. They'd be playing in front of more people than they'd ever seen. But Carlos wasn't nervous. He was ready. "I'm gonna kill it," he told his drummer, Michael Shreve, as they walked through the backstage area. "People are gonna remember our set. This is our moment." Michael nodded, but didn't share Carlos's confidence. He was 19, younger than Carlos, and the magnitude of Woodstock was starting to sink in. The backstage area was a maze of trailers, tents, and equipment cases. Musicians wandered around, some rehearsing, some just talking, trying to process what this festival might become. There was an energy in the air, anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Carlos carried his guitar case everywhere. He'd been practicing obsessively for weeks. He'd worked out every solo, every transition, every moment of their set. He knew exactly how he wanted to play. Fast, technical, impressive. He wanted people to see what he could do. Someone mentioned that Jimi Hendrix was around, probably in one of the trailers. Carlos had studied Jimmy's playing for 2 years. He'd listened to Are You Experienced hundreds of times, trying to decode the techniques, figure out how Jimmy got those sounds. He felt like he'd learned a lot. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to understand the approach, the style, the vocabulary. "You think Jimmy would talk to us?" Carlos asked one of the festival organizers. "Probably. He's pretty relaxed, not like some of the others." Carlos felt a surge of excitement. Meeting Jimi Hendrix, getting to talk about guitar, maybe even playing together for a few minutes. It would be perfect. A validation of everything he'd been working toward. He found out which trailer Jimmy was using and walked over. The door was partially open. He could hear voices inside, laughing, casual conversation. He knocked. "Yeah, come in," someone called. Carlos opened the door. The trailer was small, cramped, filled with people. Jimmy was sitting on a couch against the far wall, holding his white Stratocaster. Not playing it, just holding it across his lap. He was wearing a colorful shirt, headband, looking relaxed but slightly tired. "Hey," Carlos said. "I'm Carlos Santana. We're playing Saturday." Jimmy looked up and smiled. "Carlos. Yeah, I heard about your band. Latin rock, right? That's cool, man." They shook hands. Jimmy's grip was gentle, almost delicate. Not what Carlos expected from someone who played so aggressively. "I've been listening to your records," Carlos said, "studying them. Your technique is, I think I'm starting to understand how you approach the guitar." Jimmy's expression didn't change. He just nodded slightly, still smiling. "Oh yeah, that's cool. I've been working on some of your ideas," Carlos continued. "The way you use feedback, the bending techniques, the wah pedal stuff. I think I've got it down pretty well." Someone in the trailer laughed quietly. Not mocking, just amused. Jimmy set his guitar down, then picked it up again. "You want to show me?" Carlos felt a flash of nervousness for the first time that day, but he pushed it away. He'd practiced. He knew what he was doing. "Sure," he said. Someone handed him a guitar. Not his own, but it didn't matter. He plugged into a small practice amp in the corner of the trailer. Carlos played a lick he'd learned from Purple Haze. Fast, technical, hitting all the right notes. He bent the strings the way Jimmy did, used vibrato the way Jimi did, even moved his hand in similar patterns. When he finished, there was silence. Jimi was watching him carefully. Not critically, just observing. "That was good," Jimi said. "You got all the notes right." But there was a but hanging in the air, even though Jimi didn't say it. "Can I try?" Jimi asked. Carlos handed him the guitar. Jimi played the same lick, the exact same notes, the exact same technique Carlos had just demonstrated, but it was completely different. Carlos felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of something he'd been missing, something he didn't even know existed until this moment. The notes were the same, the technique was the same, but the feeling was entirely different. Jimi wasn't playing fast to impress anyone. He wasn't showing off his technical ability. He was saying something with those notes, communicating something Carlos couldn't quite articulate, but could absolutely feel. "You played the notes," Jimi said quietly, "but you didn't play the space between the notes." Carlos didn't fully understand what that meant, but he nodded anyway. Then Jimi did something that would haunt Carlos for the rest of his life. He played a single chord, E major, the most basic chord in rock music, something Carlos had played 10,000 times, something every guitarist learns in their first week. But Jimi played it differently. He struck the chord, then immediately bent one note inside it, just slightly, creating a dissonance that resolved back. He let it sustain, then killed the sustain at exactly the right moment. Not too early, not too late. He added a tiny vibrato, barely noticeable, just enough to make the chord feel alive rather than static. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, Carlos Santana realized he didn't understand anything about the guitar. Not really. He'd been thinking about guitar playing as a collection of techniques. Learn the techniques, apply them correctly, and you'd be good, maybe even great. But what Jimi just did wasn't technical. It was something else entirely. It was honesty. It was vulnerability. It was saying something true with 6 strings and wood. Carlos felt his chest tighten. His breathing became shallow. The room seemed to tilt slightly. It was just a chord. Just one chord. But it contained everything Carlos had been searching for without knowing he was searching. It had soul. It had truth. It had that indefinable quality that separates music from noise, art from craft, masters from students. The room was quiet. Someone coughed. Jimi handed the guitar back to Carlos. "You're good, man. You're going to do great at Woodstock. Just play what you feel, not what you think you should feel." Carlos took the guitar but couldn't speak. His throat felt tight. His hands were trembling slightly. He mumbled something, probably thank you, and left the trailer. Outside, the late afternoon sun was still bright. People were walking around laughing, getting ready for the festival. Everything looked the same, but Carlos felt completely different. He walked back to his band's trailer and sat on the steps. His hands were shaking. Michael came out. "You okay?" "I just met Jimi." "Cool. What was he like?" Carlos didn't answer right away. He was trying to process what happened. "I don't know how to play guitar," he finally said. Michael laughed. "What are you talking about? You're incredible." "No," Carlos said. "I know techniques. I can play fast. I can play complicated stuff. But I don't know how to actually play yet." Michael didn't understand. How could he? He hadn't been in that trailer. He hadn't heard that single chord. Saturday came. Santana performed in the afternoon. Carlos was supposed to be confident, ready, excited. Instead, he was terrified. The night before, he'd barely slept. He kept thinking about that chord, about Jimi's words. "Play what you feel, not what you think you should feel." Walking to the stage, Carlos felt like he was moving through water. Everything seemed slow, unreal. He could hear the crowd, thousands of voices. He could see other musicians watching from the side. This was supposed to be his breakthrough, but now he didn't want to show anything. He just wanted to tell the truth. His hands shook as he picked up his guitar. Michael counted off, and then they were playing. Something had shifted. Instead of trying to impress, he tried to do what Jimi said. He tried to play what he felt. Soul sacrifice became something different that day. Not a demonstration of technical ability, but an actual sacrifice of ego, a surrender to something bigger. His fingers found notes he hadn't planned. His solos went places his mind hadn't mapped. He wasn't thinking, just feeling, responding, being honest. The crowd went wild. One of the most legendary performances of the entire festival. But Carlos barely remembered it. He was crying inside, feeling every note pulled from somewhere deep in his chest. When it ended, he walked off stage in a daze. Someone said it was incredible, that he'd just become a star. Carlos nodded but couldn't speak. He didn't feel incredible. He felt broken open. He went back to his hotel that night and didn't come out for 3 days. His bandmates checked on him. He told them he was fine, just tired. But that wasn't true. The first night, Carlos sat on the edge of the hotel bed, guitar in his lap, trying to play that E major chord the way Jimi had. He struck it, let it ring. Nothing special, nothing magical. He tried again, and again. By 3 a.m., his fingers were sore. The chords still sounded dead, technical but emotionless. The second day, he didn't eat. Curtains drawn, playing the same chord over and over, trying different vibrato, different sustain, different emotional intentions. Sometimes he'd get close. The chord would feel alive, resonating with something deeper. But then he'd lose it. Michael knocked around noon. "Carlos, we need to celebrate. People are calling us the breakthrough band." "I'm busy," Carlos said through the door. "Busy with what?" "Learning." The third day, something shifted. Carlos woke at dawn and played the chord without thinking. Not trying to sound like Jimi, not trying to impress, just honest. And there it was. Not the same as Jimi's, but real, true. He cried from relief. The goal wasn't to sound like Jimi. The goal was to sound like himself with the same honesty. He spent those 3 days playing that single E major chord, over and over, trying to make it sound the way Jimi made it sound, trying to understand what space between the notes meant, trying to find honesty instead of technique. He cried multiple times, not from sadness, from frustration, from revelation, from the painful understanding that he'd been approaching music the wrong way, that he'd been playing guitar like it was a sport rather than a language. Years later, in a 1989 interview with Rolling Stone, Carlos would talk about that moment in the trailer. "I walked in thinking I understood Jimi's playing," he said. "I thought I'd studied his technique enough to get it. I was so arrogant." The interviewer asked what changed. "He played one chord, and in that moment I understood the difference between playing guitar and being a guitarist. Playing guitar is about fingers and fretboards. Being a guitarist is about telling the truth, being vulnerable, letting people see who you are through the instrument. Did it hurt? It destroyed me. For 3 days I couldn't do anything but sit in my hotel room and practice that same chord. I cried because I realized how much I didn't know. I cried because I'd been faking it, trying to impress people. Jimi showed me what I'd been missing my entire musical life. And then I started over. I had to relearn everything, not the technical stuff, but the reason for playing. Jimi didn't play to show off. He played to communicate something that couldn't be said with words." The interviewer pressed, "Your playing changed after Woodstock. Was that all from that one meeting?" Carlos nodded. "Every note I've played since has been influenced by those 3 seconds. Every album, every solo, I'm still trying to find that honesty." Other musicians noticed too. Eric Clapton mentioned Carlos in a 1975 article. Whatever happened to Santana at Woodstock, he came out different. Less concerned with being the fastest guitarist and more concerned with being the most honest one. Young guitarists would seek out Carlos for advice, and Carlos would tell them about the chord. "Find someone who plays with complete honesty. Watch them closely. It'll hurt your ego. It'll make you question everything." Good. That pain is where real growth begins. When Jimi died in September 1970, just over a year after Woodstock, Carlos was shattered. He'd only met him once, only spent 20 minutes in that trailer. But that 20 minutes had changed everything. Carlos was in the studio when he heard. Someone came in with a newspaper. The headline, "Jimi Hendrix Dead at 27. He read it 3 times before it registered. He put down his guitar, walked outside, sat on the curb, stayed there for 2 hours. His producer came out. "You okay?" "I only met him once, but he saved my life." At a Santana concert the week after, Carlos stopped mid-song and told the audience a story. A year ago, I met Jimi Hendrix. I was young and cocky. He showed me one chord, just one. It changed my life. He taught me that music isn't about impressing people. It's about honesty. The crowd was silent. Then Carlos played that E major chord, the way Jimmy had played it, or as close as he could get. He let it sustain longer than was comfortable. Let the silence afterward stretch. "This is for Jimmy," Carlos said quietly, "who taught me everything in 3 seconds." Several people in the audience were crying. Carlos didn't play another note for a full minute. He just stood there, head down. For the rest of his career, Carlos would talk about that moment to young guitarists. Find someone better than you. Watch them play. Let it hurt. Then use that pain to become honest instead of impressive. In his 2014 memoir, Carlos wrote an entire chapter about those 20 minutes. "I've played for presidents and popes. I've filled stadiums and won Grammys. But the most important musical moment of my life happened in a trailer at Woodstock, watching a master play one chord and realizing I knew nothing. Someone once asked if he ever matched what Jimmy did. Carlos laughed. No, never. But I'm still trying. Every time I play, I'm still trying to find that honesty. Jimmy showed me what's possible. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to get there." He paused, looked away. "Sometimes I dream about that trailer. In the dream, I get to thank him. But I always wake up before he responds." The story of that encounter became somewhat mythical in rock circles. Young guitarists would hear it and think it was exaggerated. How could one chord change everything? How could 3 seconds in a trailer reshape someone's entire approach to music? But anyone who saw Carlos Santana play before Woodstock and after Woodstock could hear the difference. Before he was technically impressive, after he was emotionally devastating. The technique was still there, maybe even better than before, but now it served something deeper. Now it was in service of truth rather than ego. 20 years old, Carlos Santana thought he was ready for Woodstock. He thought he understood the guitar. He thought he'd learned everything he needed to know. Then Jimi Hendrix showed him one chord, and Carlos cried for 3 days. Not because he was defeated, but because he was finally, painfully, beautifully awake. The lesson wasn't about guitar. It was about truth, about the difference between playing notes and saying something that matters.